made, to fill the hearts which thou hast made. Please stand. Yes, you may. Go ahead.
Those are books from the essays you brought, right? There's some more downstairs?
That's it. That's all that's left.
You brought them from downstairs up here? Oh, all right. We had these books downstairs. I have a little bin for extra donations for the free. Did anybody put money for the books in those bins? Because I want to make sure that Father knows that the money was for the books in those little tubs. Did you give Father the money for these books? Is there anybody that put money in the tub? Okay.
I bought the red book.
Okay, so you left the money on the table downstairs? Okay, so that's what I need to know, how much was left downstairs for the books. So Father knows that those are for the books.
Well, I'll tell you a secret. I have a vow of poverty, and I literally own nothing. If I left the order tomorrow, I would have no credit history. So everything goes in that little tub goes to my superior. But it's good to know what the books were for.
Do you want us to keep track of that, or
No.
don't you particularly care?
What's that?
With the books, like if they put money.
Oh no, it's good to have a distinguished, which is for the or donation stipend, because that'll go to my superior, and then the books. They like to keep account of that if you can.
Solanus, people can put the money downstairs in a minute. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, and who bought the Pietrelcina book and put the money in their bin?
Now I can't use those signs anymore. That's okay.
Oh.
That's all right.
I'm sorry.
That means I just.
So now, I would say after this, if you want to put the money on the table, I can make some more for you.
You're so good. Thank you, dear. You're beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Please stand. The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. At that time, Jesus told a parable to those who had been invited, noticing how they were choosing places of honor at the table. When you're invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not recline at table in the place of honor. A more distinguished guest than you may have been invited by him, and the host who invited both of you may approach you and say, "Give your place to this man." And then you would proceed with embarrassment to take the lowest place. Rather, when you are invited, go and take the lowest place, so that when the host comes, you and he may say, "My friend, move up to a higher position." Then you will enjoy the esteem of your companions at the table. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
I don't know if that gospel is any better illustrated in the living example of saints of the Franciscan tradition than the two that I'm about to speak to you about in this conference. Of course, Blessed Solanus Casey and now Saint Pio of Pietrelcina. And one of the reasons that I talk about these two particular from our Franciscan tradition and the Capuchins in particular, there's a lot of Capuchin saints. We have, in fact, the most canonized saints as a congregation in the whole Catholic Church. 90% of those were not priests. Okay? Most of those were lay brothers, Capuchin lay brothers. And they really are the model of our life. Francis, of course, was also not a priest. There's even, we know only by legend that he was ordained a deacon, but we have actually no records that he was. We have no, I don't know if you're aware of that or not, but it's a story that Francis was ordained a deacon, and some suspect that it was because to get the rule approved, to have a superior who was a non-cleric as a superior over priests and deacons, over clerics. Who knows? There's speculation about that. That's actually true even today. But so that certainly was plausible. But it's just that we have no record of his ordination to the diaconate from the Middle Ages. So we don't know. We assume that he was. He's hailed by the church, and his feast day is Francis of Assisi deacon, right? So there's a long tradition that he was. But really, Francis didn't feel worthy of the priesthood. God help us. But he had great devotion to the Eucharist. There's a beautiful book written by a Dominican friar, Augustine Thompson, on the story of St. Francis of Assisi. I don't know if you know this book, but if you're interested in Francis history, it's a really good book. He tried to remove some of the extrapolated hagiographical material from the story of St. Francis to get at sort of the core of who he was. And what Father Thompson, Dominican friar, and what he said was that the core of Francis's spirituality was the Eucharist. That the core of St. Francis was his devotion to the Holy Eucharist, and he certainly loved the Mass and devoutly, served it. And so he goes on to talk about different aspects of that. But the two that I want to talk about specifically today, because in this age, as I mentioned before, of great cynicism about the church, about religious persons, clerics in particular, and just religion in general, in this age of great skepticism, these two members of our tradition alone are bringing countless tens of souls quietly back to God, even in this day. As I said, I was at the beatification for Father Solanus at Ford Field. We were several of us there, and Father Tim was also there. 80,000 people, and even today, there's countless visitors to the Solanus Casey Center up in Detroit, and constant stories of people either coming back to the faith or into the faith because of this simple Franciscan soul. Padre Pio was, when he died, when Solanus was born in a little farm in Wisconsin in 1870, he was the sixth of 16 children born to Irish immigrants, and two of his siblings died of a diphtheria outbreak on the farm, and he got it and almost died from it. And it broke his vocal cords or something. He left his voice, this very characteristic sort of high, raspy, pitchy voice the rest of his life. But he did survive it, and he stayed on the farm, until he was in his 20s, helping his family. So he sort of, when he finally went to the seminary, he was considered a later vocation, in his early 20s. When he died in 1957, born in obscurity, certainly, but when he died in 1957 in Detroit, there were 20,000 people at his funeral mass. There were 80,000 at the beatification. And as I said, Archbishop Vigneron said he could have filled Ford Field at least 3 times for all the people that wanted to come. They had to cut off registration for the Mass 3 months in advance. And he was in the ground when they buried him in Detroit in 1957 for 30 years. I was in the seminary in Cleveland in 1987 when they exhumed his body to begin the process for his beatification. And that exhumation coincided with a meeting of our Capuchin superiors from our 5 provinces from across the United States. And so they were there for the exhumation. They were there to witness the exhumation. And our Father Francis Fugini and Father Gervais Degenhardt, who Father Francis just died, Father Gervais lives with us at the Curia in Pittsburgh, and he told the story because when they dug down into the monastery cemetery to get his remains, the cement vault that his body was in was cracked, and was water full of it. And so he was floating in water for 30 years. And they expect to find nothing in there, of course. So they pulled it out, and they had to drill holes in it to get the water out so they could open it. And when they opened it, and there's actually video on YouTube of this, but they opened it up, and it's all tattered, and his habit's all tattered. But they said he looked like he was sleeping. His blue eyes, as blue as the day he closed them in 1957. They said his skin was a little bluish, certainly from the water. There was, they said, a little damage on his elbows for whatever reason. But they said after about an hour or so, his skin, dried back to a natural tone. They put a habit on him, and they trimmed his hair, and they said he looked like he was sleeping. And the interesting thing, too, about it was you can see in the photo and in the banner in the church, he had terrible arthritis all over his body. And he had eczema his entire adult life, terrible case of eczema all over his skin. And when he was here in this house in Huntington from 1946 to 56, he developed a terrible skin disease on his legs, similar to psoriasis. It's a condition called erysipelas. And in 1956, they brought him back to Detroit, and they had him at St. John's Hospital, and it was bad, and they were going to amputate his legs from it. He prayed, and the condition got a little better. There's actual photos of him at this house back in the late 40s. That condition was so painful on his legs, he would go out even in the winter in his sandals, and he'd grab a garden hose, pour it over the skin on his legs. It was, the condition was so painful, and it was the only way he could get any relief. And he'd pour, water on his skin just to get some relief from the disease. So, anyway, when they exhumed him, no arthritis, no eczema, no erysipelas on his legs. He said he looked healthier than when he was alive. And I asked Brother Richard, who was the postulator for his cause up in Detroit, when they put him in a new coffin since the beatification, and I said, how does he look? He said, he's the same. He looks like he could get up and walk around. And so just a sign, a little sign. Nope, not that I'm aware of. Yeah. One of the friars from that province came to our house to give a retreat to our friars, and one of our friars who was on kidney dialysis at the time asked. He had some relics of Father Solanus. He says about intercession for us, for the Capuchins, and the friar from Detroit told our friars in Pittsburgh. He said Father Solanus doesn't help Capuchins. He said, we're supposed to suffer. So he said, I went into my room and I got rid of all my relics. But I was there at the beatification ceremony with a group from Cleveland. We had about 50 people. And we got there in the morning, and I had called ahead and asked for permission to have Mass with my group on the cloistered side of the chapel where Father Solanus used to celebrate Mass. That altar is preserved. The one I was telling you he used to pray in front of at night, And so I got special permission, which I didn't realize when I got there. The people who ran the center were all upset that the friars gave me the permission because there were so many people there, well, anyway, it was a privilege. So we had the Mass there, but when we walked in the Casey Center, it was in the morning, and there was a woman, a black woman, at a distance. She was staring right at me, and I was talking to people, and she was talking to people, and time went on, she's constantly staring at me. Finally, she came out of the crowd, and she came up to me, and she has a Spanish accent. She introduced herself as Paula Zarate from Panama. And nice lady, I didn't know who she was, nice little conversation. And then that afternoon at Ford Field, when we were there for the Mass, she was in the front of the procession because she was the miracle for the beatification. And what happened was the friars in the Detroit province have a mission in Panama. And she worked at that church. So she was a teacher in that school, and she was a catechist for the children for sacraments. And she had developed as a young person a very rare, incurable skin disease called ichthyosis. It's a ichthy fish. So the skin looks like the scales of a fish. Very painful. There is no cure for it. And she had it her whole life. She had to keep covered because it was hard for people to look at it. And also, she lived at the equator, so the sun irritated it. And the friars brought her on a pilgrimage group from Panama to Detroit in 2012. And she went in the center and she said, "What is that wooden table and those papers on top of it?" They said, "Well, that's not a table, that's Father Solanus' sarcophagus, and those are prayer petitions." So she kneels down there and she fills out like 17 of these little pieces of paper, none of them for herself, for her family and her students and things. And the friars, she was there quite a while, and the friars said, "Paula, come on, it's time for lunch." So she got up, and she said as soon as she got up, she heard a voice that said, "Nothing for you." So she knelt back down, she said, and filled out one more piece of paper about the disease, put it on the grave. Said she went to lunch, and she was starting to get nauseous during the lunch, and she excused herself. They gave her a guest room at the friary. She laid down to take a nap. As she was getting up from her nap, these scales on her skin are falling onto the sheets like rain. And she scoops them up like this, and to show the friars, they took her to a dermatologist in Detroit. And so when she went home to Panama, her female dermatologist said she broke into tears. So that's impossible. It's a God, because there is no cure for this disease. And to this day, she has perfect skin, unaffected. So he was a great intercessor for all kinds of beautiful favors. One of the stories that I have to tell you about him, that the friars in Detroit love to tell about Father Solanus, is that there was a young man who was a candidate for the order. And he somehow developed some kind of an infection or disease in his jaw. And he was going to have to go to the dentist. A particular young man was deathly afraid of the dentist. So, and they were going to dismiss him from formation because we didn't take people who had physical, problems like that. And so there was contemplation of dismissing him from formation. So he went into the front office where Father Solanus was with Brother Leo Wallenweber, his longtime secretary, and who had a little desk next to his. And this young friar comes in desperate, and he says, "Father, please pray for me. They're going to kick me out of the order, and I hate the dentist, and I have to go to the dentist." And he just waits, and he says, "Calm down." He goes, "I'll say a prayer for you." So off he goes to the dentist. This is in the middle of the summer. It's hot in Detroit, no air conditioning, porter's office. This gentleman comes in with 2 ice cream cones for Father Solanus and Brother Leo. And Father Solanus takes it, "Oh, thank you very much." And he takes the ice cream cones, opens the wooden drawer of the desk, puts the ice cream cones in the wooden drawer, closes the drawer. "And we'll save those for later," he said. Some hours later, this young friar comes back from the dentist and says, "Father, great news. I don't have to have, my disease is gone. It's cured. The doctor said I'm going to be fine." He goes, he says, "Let's celebrate." And he opens the drawer, pulls out 3 perfectly intact ice cream cones. Middle of a hot summer, and the 3 of them sat there eating these ice cream cones. So they love to tell that story in Detroit. Take it for what it is. There were just countless stories of favors. What happened with him was that, as I said, he stayed on the farm till he was a mature adult, young adult. And his older brother, there's a very pious Irish Catholic family, and many stories of him as a child, them taking his father and his mother taking turns taking the children to masses on Sundays with the horse-drawn wagon, and even in the winter. And when they couldn't get there to the church, he said his father would stay home and read the missal to the children, and his father would give a sermon, to the family, right? Preach a sermon on the readings. But a very pious Irish Catholic family, so you can imagine some of the boys might be interested in the priesthood. Of course, the first one was the one to go off to first, and his older brother, Maurice. And he went to what was called in those days the German seminary out in Wisconsin, which meant that the classes were taught in German. So imagine, you don't speak that language, you're Irish family, and you're trying to study Latin and Greek and all these other courses while they're teaching you in German, right? And many of the books were in German, High German, right? So he didn't make it. And after he was there for a couple of years, 3 years, or 3 or 4 years, I think, and they dismissed him. They said, "You'll never make it, go home." So he went home to farm, very kind of crestfallen, and Maurice would later go back and be ordained when Father Solanus was, 1904, he'd go back to the seminary. Eventually he became a priest. And another one of the boys also. So 3 of the KC boys ended up becoming priests. One was a Monsignor and a missionary. And Maurice had a kind of very different story of the priesthood, very limited in many ways, but 3 of the boys were priests eventually. Solanus took some odd jobs, and he worked as a hospital orderly, he worked as a lumberjack, he was famously a guard at the Minnesota State Prison. He guarded a very famous prisoner named Cole Younger, who had been part of the Jesse James gang. And Cole Younger gave Barney Casey, his name was Bernard, they called him Barney. It's said that Cole Younger came to faith in Christ because of his young pious guard named Barney Casey. And Cole Younger gave him his wooden footlocker, which Father Solanus had in the monastery till the day he died. It's actually been lost. When they renovated at the Casey Center, I asked Brother Richard about it. He says, "We don't know what happened to it. It was up in the attic, and when we were going to put all the displays together, somehow it walked off." But anyway, if you know anybody that has it, please tell them to bring it back. They would love to have it back in Detroit. So that was the second to last. The very last job was he was working as a streetcar operator in Superior, Wisconsin. In fact, he was the youngest streetcar operator in the city. And a tragic event happened one day where he had to stop the streetcar because there was a terrible scene of a woman covered in blood laying on the tracks and a drunken sailor with a knife with her blood on it standing over her hurling curses at the woman. And he got out of the car and he picked up the woman. She died in his arms. And there was something about that experience that just cracked in him. And he said, "I've just got to do something else with my life. I can't be driving this streetcar the rest of my life." So he decided, even though what had happened to his brother, to give it a try at the same seminary. Same thing happened. And he was kicked out. And but they said with him, they could see he was a very pious young man. And they said, "Well, maybe you have a vocation. Why don't you try a religious order? Maybe they'll take you." Okay? And so he was out there and he visited the Dominicans, the Jesuits, the Franciscans, and his last stop was us, Capuchins. And in our old constitutions from 1536, our order was only required to bathe, let's say, irregularly. And so we had that reputation even in Europe, actually. They call the Capuchins the stinky friars. It's a whole other story about that, I'll tell you sometime. But so he went in and he sees all these German Capuchins, these long scraggly beards, because we weren't allowed to trim the beards. We were required to have a beard. In fact, under our old constitutions, you were required by custom of the order to grow a beard when you became a novice. And if anything would do, like even if you looked like a chia pet, you know, it would be enough, right? But if you couldn't physically raise a beard, you were allowed to be in the order, but you could never be a superior. It was a sign from God. Okay? So they were required to have a beard and untrimmed. Okay? And the old constitutions described the custom of the beard with 3 adjectives: manly, austere, and despised. And so these friars, these long, they call them in German, or in Italian, the barba longa, these guys with these really long beards. And I tell people, you know, our old monasteries, because of the bathing issue, was full of more than the odor of sanctity. And he was not impressed. It was just not his image of what the priesthood was. And they were encouraging, though, to him. You know, the friars, they saw he was kind of crestfallen. They were trying to encourage him. They could see he was pious. And they said, well, why don't you just at least give it a try? You know, you have a kind of funny sound out of your throat when you speak. If you wear a beard, maybe it'll help your voice. You know, keep no. So he went home. He didn't know what to do. And he talked to his mom and his sister and asked them to join him in a novena to Our Lady, which would end on the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, December the 8th. And so they prayed the novena, and he said he heard at the end, the last day, a clear voice that said, go to Detroit, which could only mean one thing, the Capuchins from this province. And so he took it as a sign. He told his mother, it was near Christmas by that time, and he said, well, I'm going. He said, you know, it's near Christmas, just stay home after Christmas, the New Year, you can go up there. He says, no, it's clear what God wants me to do. So he got on a train, took several days to get up to Detroit. And he arrived just before Christmas. And the normal austerity of the house, because we fasted almost all year long, the friars, and very, very strict kind of life of Capuchins in those days. But that was replaced by the festivity of the season of Christmas, the beautiful liturgies in Latin and the beautiful hymns in German, and he just knew that he was home. And he spent the rest of his life. So he joined the order. Another problem happened, same problem. Friars in Detroit were German. So we went to our seminary, which was also taught in the German language, struggled all through it. But at the end, near the end, the student master, who was a brilliant priest and theologian from Germany, Father Anthony, could see that he was a very sincere, pious young man. He was always the first to go to engage the brothers at recreation. He was the first in the chapel, the last to leave. He was always kind presence. He was always helpful. He clearly had a sincere religious vocation. And he wanted to help him, you know, so when they were in class and they were speaking in German, he would throw like these softball questions in German to Father Solanus, just, you know, like trying to help him a little bit. And in the end, it was Father Anthony that took his side to support his desire for the priesthood. So what happened was that there was a lot of discussion about him because they were concerned that he wouldn't be able to perform the pastoral ministry with their people because many of the faithful that attended our church there were German, and many of the faithful would go to confession in German, and often the priests in those days preached in German. So they weren't sure he would be up to that, really. And that was a sincere concern. But Father Anthony took his side and said, no, let's do it. Just ordain him. So they ordained him to minor orders, subdiaconate, diaconate, eventually a priesthood. In the old days, before the council, you didn't have this, what we have now, diaconate year, where a priest serves as a deacon temporarily what we call transitional diaconate, before they ordained to the priesthood. In the old days, they ordained you fully a priest without faculties to preach or to hear confessions. It was called the simplex year. So most priests and all the friars of our province for generations, they did that. They would be ordained simplex, and in those days they would help with solemn masses, and they would celebrate, take masses for the missions and things like that they did during the simplex year. So he was ordained along with his other classmates in the simplex year, but they never gave him faculties. He was a simplex the rest of his life. So in Detroit, they called him the brother that says Mass, okay? Because he couldn't hear confessions and he couldn't preach, wasn't allowed to preach. Actually, in the old days, there was to preach, you had to pass a licentiate exam. You had to pass the exam, and then once you got the certificate, then you were allowed to preach sermons. Maybe we should bring that back. I don't know. But Padre Pio also never took the exam. He spent his last years in formation with his uncle, who was the parish priest in their town. He lived above his parents' garage the last 7 years of his formation, right? So neither of them actually had the certificate or the faculties to preach. When Padre Pio was restored to public ministry after the suspicion around his stigmata, 1933, the local bishop of Monfreduccio, as an honorary and as like a kind of an affirmation, gave him permission to preach, but he never preached, hardly ever, Padre Pio. One of the friars in the New Jersey province that I knew lived with him in Italy in the 60s, and he said he never spoke in church. I said, I once heard him preach a sermon. I about fell asleep. He goes, he said he did not win over countless tens of thousands of souls because of his gift of oratory, right? But Solanus also never, the rest of his life had faculties, but he was Irish. He had the gift of gab, right? And he would give these little spiritual talks. Classically, on every Wednesday, even now, up in Detroit, they have a service for the sick where they bring out the relic of the true cross. They preach a little sermon and then bless people with the communion rail with the relic of the true cross. Father used to give those little talks, and we called them, we made a distinction in the old days between formal sermons and what you call today a homily, or like a little pious exhortation, or fervorino, they called them. And he was allowed to give those, and he often did. And he got to be very known for them, and in fact, a very famous professor of preaching came in those days from Sacred Heart Seminary in Detroit because he heard about these and wanted to hear how he spoke. And he said, he just says the simplest pious things over and over again. I don't see what the big deal is. Love Jesus, love Mary, all this stuff. The people were enraptured. They knew when he was speaking, they were listening to a saint. You know, they just hung on his words. So anyway, he was a very humble soul. And I think I told you the story about Monsignor Cope from my home diocese in Youngstown. I told you that story already, right? So there's an old Monsignor from Youngstown Diocese, and they were in the seminary back in the 50s when Father Solanus was at St. Bonaventure's. They drove from Cleveland up to Detroit. They wanted to meet him. And they get to the monastery door, and they knock on the door. This old Capuchin comes, and he says, "Can I help you?" And they said, "Well, we'd like to meet Father Solanus." And the friar said, "Well, come on in. There's been nothing but trouble since he got here." It was Father Solanus. If there's anything that characterized these two saints, it was obedience and humility. Absolutely. Father could have, in the biography, the editors comment that, he was Irish and by temperament, fiery temper. But nobody ever remembers him that way. He was a transformed person by grace. And he was the most patient soul you'd ever meet. Patient with others, patient with himself. He was a sanctified soul. People would pour into that porter's office and just pour out their hearts and their troubles in front of him, and he'd offer beautiful words of consolation in simple ways. Everybody walked away from him feeling that they had encountered God, right? And countless stories of that. But because he would never rush people when they were talking, he was always late for stuff in the monastery, especially lunch. Okay, and he never ate much anyway, as you can see. So in the old days, our Capuchin custom was, and you see our dear friars of the renewal here of the Reform primitive observance, when they go in, a lot of times they'll kiss the floor in the chapel when they go in. Well, that was our custom in our own constitutions. We all did that. But we didn't just do it in the chapel. We also did that when you went in the dining room. Okay? And you did that when you went in the superior's office. You went to talk to the superior, you got down on all floors and kissed the floor. You arms out like this, and you say, Benedicite. And if the superior was having a good day, he'd let you sit down. If not, he'd drink his coffee, having a conversation with you while you're kneeling there on the floor. Okay? But if you came in late to the dining room, you had to go up to the head table where the superior was sitting and do that, kiss the floor, and ask for permission in front of everybody to sit down. Sometimes they would let you. Okay? So he kisses the floor, and Father was always late, so just automatically walk right up to the superior's table. Particular occasion, a bishop had come to the friary, wanted to meet Father Solanus, was sitting next to the provincial at the head table. And Father Solanus walks in, kisses the floor, Benedicite, and the provincial looks at the bishop and says, Your Excellency, I would like you to meet the late Father Solanus. He just took it in stride and sat down, That's the kind of soul he was. This is a picture of humility, love, joy, just trust in the providence of God, right? And he spread that everywhere. I happened to be at the monastery in the spring of that year, and I think I told you this story about the nun who told the story about her sister being healed. This nun she said her sister had an infection in the back of her ear, and Father just put his arthritic fingers under her little ear and blessed her, and said as soon as he blessed her, her temperature started to drop, and she never had to have the surgery and never had a recurrence of the infection. There was just incredible things. So when he was ordained, his first assignment was at Sacred Heart in Yonkers, New York, 1904. And the story goes that he arrived there, and he's sitting in front of the superior, the local guardian there at the house, and pastor. And the friar doesn't know what to do with him because he's a priest and he's not allowed to hear confessions, he's not allowed to preach sermons. So he didn't know what he was going to do with him. And he said, you will. He didn't even know what he was going to say. And the doorbell rang. Said, you will answer the door. And Father did that for the next 50 years. Like no one else had ever answered the door. Because these spirit favors started even then in New York. What would happen is people would come in and they would ask for prayers for particular issues, and he would say, well, I'll say a mass for you, or I'll have a mass said for you in the foreign missions, the Seraphic Mass Association. So he was the porter. He was in charge of taking those mass stipends. And when he would register somebody's name in the ledger for the Seraphic Masses, that's when this stuff started to happen. And he had such childlike faith in the power of the Mass, the grace that came from the Mass, that, as I said, that's when a lot of these physical and spiritual favors began to occur. They both had lots of physical sufferings. Padre Pio had all kinds of digestional things, even as a child, and he had skin cancer. He had all kinds of physical problems himself, and he suffered tremendously. But they brought such healing to people. And the stories of Padre Pio, for instance, at night with his encounters of diabolical oppression. He's never he was never possessed, but of oppression. That is, that the devil would beat him up at night because he did so much good during the day, right? So Padre Pio, there's famous stories of noises coming out of the friary. It's on Giovanni Rotondo. But actually, that happened too for Solanus. The friars will tell you that. I think one of the reasons why he spent so much time in the chapel at night was, in some ways, he was leery about getting into all that up in his cell. And so that actually happened with both of them, less famously for Solanus. But Padre Pio, when he died, there were 100,000 people at his funeral mass. When he died, the famous stigmata disappeared from his body, and that's not uncommon with stigmatists. That happened before. This book, particular edition of this book, goes into some of the medical evidence about that was released after his canonization. But when he first got the stigmata in the early days, there was a lot of skepticism as to whether or not Padre Pio was actually doing this to himself. And so there was a famous priest, scientist, doctor from Rome named Gemelli. There's a hospital in Rome named after this man. And he called the superior down at San Giovanni wanting to examine Padre Pio. He doubted it. And so the superior, the guardian, said, "Are you the official, delegate that's come from Rome officially?" And he said, "No, it's just on my own. I'd like to see Padre Pio." He goes, "Well, then no." When when the Holy See sends an official delegation down here, he will be seen, but not until then. Well, like a good Italian, he went down there anyway. He shows up at the friary. He met briefly Padre Pio, did not examine him, somehow got into his room, and there was a bottle of carbolic acid on his shelf that the friars used to sterilize needles during the influenza epidemic. That was very common. Even today, there's a apothecary, a drugstore that the friars have had since our tradition, since the 16th century. It was not uncommon at all. But he conjectured that Padre Pio was using this acid to create this effect on his skin. Of course, this was not true. And later, there were many, many medical examinations of Padre Pio's wounds done. A number of x-rays, doctors looking at them very closely. And what they said was there was like a thin membrane on either side of the wounds, each of the wounds. And then there was a void in between. He would inexplicably bleed from them, bled about a cup of blood a day. But his own blood level never decreased, that they tested him. On one particular occasion, the Roman authorities wrapped his hands with special white cloths and put the wax seals on them, and then left him for like 2 months to see if they would start to heal. And they came back, of course, they were just as the same as when they put them on. And so after countless medical, scientific studies, they were completely affirmed to be authentic. But nevertheless, he was removed from public ministry over that. And both of them had different reasons to be resentful of those in higher authority, both in the order and of the wider church. Not so much Solanus with the wider church, but certainly Padre Pio. And because Father Gemelli said to the Pope at the time that he was the greatest fraud ever perpetrated on the Catholic Church. And that accusation got him removed from ministry. Okay? Later, the Pope, after he went through a detailed examination, the Pope would later say that while I have never been ill-disposed toward Padre Pio, I have been ill-informed. And that really was the launch, that obedience that he dealt with in terms of authority figures and the way that he dealt with it, with complete resignation. First of all, he knew the truth. He didn't have to worry about that. And I'm sure that he was happy for a little bit of a break from the confessional and the altar for a couple of years in public. But the spirit that both of them had was completely deferential to legitimate authority, even though they weren't always treated well. Solanus was, kind of sidelined in many ways. He was kind of quirky, and they kept him away from the students, and things like that. But a later provincial at the St. Joseph province would say he was the greatest man our province ever produced, right? So their gifts were, their characteristics of humility were affirmed by not only their own local superiors, but by all those who come to know their charism, been inspired by them over the years. And I would suggest too that the gift, the virtue of humility, which is so linked to the charism of our founder and so important for him because it's linked to poverty and it's linked to the cross, I would suggest that for us, that one of the ways that we learn from them as Franciscans is in two ways. The humility, characteristically, just a couple of things about it. Humility has its roots in the earth, humus. It's a reminder of where we came from and where we're going. St. John Chrysostom tells us that the grave is the school where we learn humility. But how can we practice this virtue before it comes to that? Humility, the word humus, from the earth. I would suggest two simple things to grow in the virtue of humility for us. First, we listen. Okay? Perhaps to our neighbor, we might actually learn something. We might not know better than our neighbor, right? Or especially our legitimate superiors, right? And even if a superior would give us a command that is ill-advised, imprudent, but not against our moral conscience, observing it, we actually grow in virtue. Even if it's misguided advice, even if we consider it not a good command, but we observe it, it's actually a source of grace for us. The second place, we ought to take pleasure when our neighbor or brother or sister is praised for their good qualities. We have a tendency on a natural level to look upon others as a rival to be outdone, rather than a brother or sister to be loved. St. Paul warns us about jealousy and envy. We must remember that the blood of Christ was shed for each one of us, not just for me. We're all members of the same spiritual family, and we can all share in the fruits of one another's talents and gifts. And so I would suggest that those might be two particular ways to grow. The last thing is that we take correction, humbly. We accept correction, whether it's in a spousal relationship with our spouse or from our religious superiors. Like Padre Pio and like Blessed Solanus Casey, they accepted correction humbly. If it is intended to be helpful, it can bring us face to face with who we really are and what we should be. And lastly, by the same token, we can exercise compassion for the weakness of others to help our neighbors, our brother or sister, rise above their weaknesses. Pride makes us insensitive to others. Humility makes us reach out to others. I think this is the final story of these two saints, and one of the reasons why so many souls respond to their legacy, their intercession, even from heaven. A mystic once said to Padre Pio while he was alive that his spiritual program would be responsible for a third of all the souls in heaven at the end of time, so that a third of everybody in heaven in the end would be there because of the spiritual program of Padre Pio. To which Padre Pio famously quipped and said, "Just a third?" Humility and not taking oneself too seriously, taking God very seriously, not taking themselves that seriously. That's one of the characteristics of a saint. And so here are Padre Pio's 5 points for growth in the spiritual life and growth in holiness. Daily Mass, weekly confession, meditation, spiritual reading, and twice daily examine your conscience. Okay? So in our culture, where you only have 12% of Catholics going to Sunday Mass, asking someone to go to Mass every day might seem a lot. But my own father, who's now 86, has been going to daily Mass his entire adult life, right? And he was a very busy manager of an office, government office, and he would only take assignments to an office where he'd go to daily Mass. So if he was asked to go to a particular town, he would go there in advance and get all the parish bulletins, make sure there was a Mass he could go to, or he wouldn't take the job. We remember that about him. We'd get up in the morning and Dad would be sitting there in the front room with his prayer book and his rosary every morning. And my grandfather owned a restaurant. My dad knew how to cook. He would make breakfast for everybody. He would get up and say his prayers, in quiet and meditation before everybody was even up. And that was his routine. Still doing it to this day. Thanks be to God. So for the poor Clares over there in Canton, Santa Clara. And Padre Pio said this, a quote from him. He said, "Renew your faith by attending Holy Mass. Keep your mind during it focused on the mystery that's unfolding before your eyes. Your mind's eye, transport yourself to Calvary, meditate on the victim who offers himself to divine justice, paying the price for your redemption." One of the things that many people don't know about him was that when he was a young priest, he started losing his eyesight. And because of that ailment, he was given a special permission that he couldn't read the breviary, or the missal on the altar. So he was given permission to say what we called the brother's office. So when the priests were praying in Latin, the brothers who didn't know Latin would pray a series of 12 Our Fathers during the various hours of the office, called the brother's office. Okay? He was given permission to do that, but he did more than that, and he would take out, let's see, what he called the weapon. Okay? And heaven only knows how many times a day he prayed this. He was constantly praying the rosary. Even when he was hearing confessions, his hands were going through the beads of the rosary. So that was his great advice to people, to pray the rosary. It was the greatest weapon, he said, against the evils of our day. And because he couldn't read the book for the Mass, he was given special permission to say the same Mass every day. Okay? And that was, in the old days, priests, seminarians were trained to memorize the Mass, because in the old Book of Canon Law from the Code of 1917, priests were required to say Mass every day under pain of mortal sin. And so, because it was a requirement, if you were ever in a situation where you didn't have a missal, you were in prison, you were blind, you didn't have one available, you could, if you had a Mass memorized, you could say it by heart. That's why, by the way, those Capuchins knew how to do that in Auschwitz. Okay? So for Padre Pio, and like for many priests, it was the votive Mass of Our Lady on Saturday. And Padre Pio said that same Mass every single day. Whether it was a sung Mass, a high Mass, or a low Mass, it was a votive Mass of Our Lady. He also had the Requiem Mass memorized, but he hardly ever did that. Almost every day was the votive Mass of the Blessed Mother. And because he didn't have to look at the book, the Mass became like a mystical experience, and countless thousands of souls are said to have been converted just by attending his Mass. Right? Graham Greene, the famous skeptic, atheist, was in Rome once and heard about it, and he went down there to attend the Mass, and afterward he was asked, "Well, did that change your mind about atheism?" And he said, "Well, it put a big crack in it." Weekly confession. St. Thomas Aquinas tells us, as I said earlier, that the effects of original sin linger with us after our baptism. A darkened intellect and a weakened will, they remain with us. And here's what I would like to share with you about this. He said weekly confession. And one might say, well, if you're going regularly to confession and you're presumably robbing a bank every month, every week, what do I have to confess? Some people will say to me in confession, and I've done this for 25 years now myself, a phrase something like this: "Father, I don't know what to confess, because every time I go to confession, I confess the same thing over and over again. My instinctive response to that is, what do you want to do? Confess something new? Every time? I mean, in the spiritual life, we are taught that we have what is called the primary fault. Okay, that's our primary sin. And it comes to us for whatever reason because of the condition where we were raised or just dispositions. And there's a distinction between the primary fault and what becomes for some people a habitual sin, or what I call people's favorite sin. Okay, they are not always the same. Sometimes one is a mask for the other. So, say perhaps a man has a struggle with anger. He can't deal with anger, and he knows if he expresses it that he gets a bad reaction. And so what he does is he finds a crutch. It squeezes out in a twisted way in some other form, whether it's some kind of an offense against the Sixth Commandment, some other kind of habitual abuse of substances or things like that, and they keep confessing that over and over. But the real issue is the anger, right? What the habitual sin, or the thing that clouds it, is what I call people's favorite sin. You know, a good confessor or a spiritual director help you identify what is more at the root of these things, at the primary fault, and just work on it. You know, you just work on it. You work with a good spiritual to try to understand what it is. Padre Pio, as I said, was a genius at confession. And so many souls were liberated through an experience with him in the confessional. The story of a young man, many of these stories, but went to confession to him, and he said, Padre Pio told me every sin I ever committed, even some I didn't even know they were sins, right, that I committed. Didn't even remember them. And I spent the rest of the day in that chapel on my knees, soaking the floor with my tears. I left that chapel a liberated man, right? He was a good confessor. He was interested in liberating people's souls, you know, not in torturing them, in liberating them, right? And he did. And so that's his advice to us. I think one of also my experiences with people about confession is that it's a trick of the devil. He keeps reminding us of our past sins that we've already confessed, and doubting the mercy of God related to our past offenses. And those can become pathologies and doors to open for sins, the despair that comes from that. Teresa, this is not new. Teresa of Avila was aware of this, and she said about it, when the devil reminds you of your past, you remind him of his future. It's her feast day today. Throw that in. St. Padre Pio used to say, my past, O Lord, to your mercy, my future to your providence, that I might live with gratitude in the present, I might live in the present with gratitude for your mercy and love. Okay? That's St. Padre Pio. Spiritual reading, Padre Pio said, when you read about God, you learn about him. But when you pray, you get to know him. Okay? And Father Solanus had one piece of spiritual advice when people would ask him, and that was the writings of the 16th century venerable nun, Mary of Agreda, The Mystical City of God. It's a 4-book series. I think Tan Books reprints it. A very classic, beautiful reflections on the life of the Blessed Mother. It also has, they have that on Audible. I've listened to the whole series in my car. They're beautiful meditations. Father was always recommending that to people for spiritual reading, the Mary of Agreda, The Mystical City of God. And in fact, about him with that was one of the reasons that they had to get him out of Detroit, because he was recommending it so much that the publishers of the book were making a ton of money off Father Solanus, because Father Solanus. And people were buying these books, and they finally said, okay, we got to get him out of here. So they sent him out here to Huntington. That's one of the reasons he got out here to Indiana. But it's a beautiful set. That was his strong advice for spiritual reading. Mental prayer. The Capuchin tradition of mental prayer began because our formation as an order began with the Camaldolese. I don't know if you know that. We got the pointy hood and the beard from the Camaldolese. And our early founders, who became later the Capuchins, were formed in this tradition of quiet meditation in the presence of the Blessed Sacrament. And we maintained that when we started our own order. And so in the old constitutions, we were required to spend 2 hours a day at minimum. That 2 hours was for the weak friar in mental prayer every day. In our current constitutions, we're required 2 periods, which in practice amounts to a holy hour. So we have an hour, half an hour before we do morning prayer at the friary, and a half an hour before evening prayer in silence together when you walk into the chapel. That has become a great pattern in my life. I can't imagine, honestly, going into the chapel and having to immediately engage in some kind of verbal, prayer. I would find that at this stage in my life, I would find that really jarring. We come in quietly, we're in silence together in front of the Blessed Sacrament, and it really allows us to enter into the Word of God that we're about to hear and the experience of the sacraments. I highly recommend this. St. Francis de Sales, who was a bishop, his spiritual director told him to make a holy hour every day. And he said, with all due respect, I'm a bishop. I'm really busy. And then his spiritual director said, well, good. Then do 2 hours. Right? The point is, people say, well, I can't do it. I can't spend a whole holy hour. I can't spend a whole half hour. Okay, 5 minutes. Try 5 minutes, right? Start with 5 minutes. Here's the point. What you want to do is develop a good habit. If you can't get to church and be in front of the Blessed Sacrament, get a beautiful crucifix, light a candle, and put yourself there in His presence in front of the crucifix for 5 or 10 minutes. Start with that. The thing is just what you want to do is incrementally, it'll grow, but you have to start the pattern. You have to establish this is a non-negotiable. I don't start my day like busy work. One of the people that I work with, she's from the Philadelphia area, a big family, 9 kids, very busy. She's a professor, busy lady. But she says, well, I listen to The Office, I listen to it, and when I'm going through the kitchen in the morning drinking coffee, I go, And, my suggestion would be you have to not get too comfortable. I mean, not to be uncomfortable, but we can get to a point where some people I work with in spiritual direction say, well, I get coffee and I sit down in my favorite chair and, and I'll, okay, all right. My recommendation would be to sit on a chair that's not real comfortable. Okay, it just keeps your body healthy, and you put yourself in front of the cross and start with silence. Start your prayer with silence. This was Padre Pio's great recommendation. Then just build on it. He used to say, 1,000 years of enjoying human glory is not worth even an hour spent sweetly communing with Jesus in the Blessed Sacrament. St. Padre Pio. Mental prayer, so important for growth in the spiritual life. And finally, he said, twice daily examine your conscience and make frequent acts of gratitude for the gift of His mercy. Okay? And so to close, I'd like to just offer you a little prayer help. And I didn't bring the cards with me. I'll give them to you in the next conference. I have these written out. But it's also on the mission, the flyer that has the examination of conscience on it. When Father Solanus was dying in the hospital in 1957, he had been for several days incoherent, not speaking. But on July the 10th, 1957, at 10 o'clock in the morning, a nurse was sitting at his bedside, and he sat up, and he opened his eyes wide open and put his arms out in the shape of a cross again. And he said, I give my soul to Jesus Christ. Lay back on the pillow and delivered his soul to God. Those words are on a plaque above that room at St. John's Hospital to this day. I would offer you this meditation on Father's last earthly words. take the beads of your rosary, and on each bead you say these 4 spiritual aspirations, and you can repeat this after me. I give my mind to Jesus Christ.
I give my mind to Jesus Christ.
I give my heart to Jesus Christ.
I give my heart to Jesus Christ.
I give my body to Jesus Christ.
I give my body to Jesus Christ.
I give my soul to Jesus Christ.
I give my soul to Jesus Christ.
Intellect, will, body, soul. The capacity is given to us by our Creator. Little act of consecration. You can do it as a single aspiration, or if you say it on the rosary, every 4 beads, it actually works out perfectly. Go right around the rosary with it. And there's a little alternative version of that prayer that I wrote that's in your envelope packet, whatever there. Then the other thing is from Padre Pio. When he was dying, he had the rosary in his hand. He couldn't even say the prayers anymore. And all he could say is the holy names, Jesus, Mary, Jesus, Mary. And with his last earthly breath, he uttered the word Maria. So I would say as a little spiritual aspiration in the memory of his last words, and this is actually from Father Angela Shaughnessy, who was a beautiful friar from our province and preached retreats for years and years. And he would say, do this. On each bead, sometimes he was my confessor, sometimes he would give this to me as a penance. He would say, take on each bead and say, Jesus, help me want to love you more and more each day. Jesus, help me want to love you more and more each day. And just go around the whole bead doing a little aspiration like that. And he also would say this in terms of intercession for people, and perhaps this applies even as to the last conference, people that need forgiveness in our lives, need healing that related to their asking us for their prayers. On each bead, you say the name of Jesus, then say the name of a person. So start with your mom and dad, Father Angelus would say, living or deceased. You say, Jesus, mom, Jesus, dad. Go through your siblings, your spouse, your children, grandchildren, if you're so blessed. Anybody else you can think of, anybody in need of your prayers. And just put their name on the bead next to Jesus. And like a priest who approaches the altar to pray for a specific intention, he forms his intention at the beginning of the Mass. When you do that, you're attaching those intentions to the weapon of the rosary. When you later pray your rosary, all those intentions are taken up into the grace of that rosary. So Father Angelus used to teach people to pray that way. Okay? And like I say, I'll give you the last of the cards with that written out at the beginning of the next conference. Just some finally quotes from Padre Pio and Blessed Solanus. Solanus would say, the only science that gives purpose to every other science is the science of religion, the science of our happy relationship and providential dependence on God and our neighbor. We are continually immersed in God's merciful grace like the air that permeates us. Gratitude is the first sign of a rational creature. Thank you, God, in all your designs. Confidence is the very soul of prayer. I love this one. Do not pray for easy lives. Pray to be stronger people. Do not pray for tasks equal to your powers. Pray for powers equal to your tasks. And this one, God condescends to use our powers if we don't spoil his plans by ours. And his most famous quote perhaps, thank God ahead of time. He would say, don't wait for God to do something for you to be grateful. Anticipate him in gratitude. Thank God ahead of time. Father Pio used to say, prayer is the best weapon we have. It's the key to the heart of God. Speak to Jesus not only with your lips, but with your heart. In fact, on certain occasions, you should only speak to him with your heart. He would say, prayer is the oxygen of the soul. Life of a Christian is nothing but a perpetual struggle against self. There is no flowering of the soul to the beauty of its perfection except at the price of pain. Have courage and do not fear the assaults of the devil. Remember this forever. It is a healthy sign if the devil shouts and roars around your conscience, since this shows that he is not inside your will. And The most beautiful act of faith is the one made in darkness, in sacrifice, and with extreme effort. Happiness is only found in heaven. Let us pray. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Blessed Solanus Casey, Saint Pio Pietrelcina, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Bless you all. You're welcome.